All right. So, as I said last week, this week's going to be a demo day. As in, I'm going to walk through creating a set of triggers so you guys actually see how they can be used in the real world. Most of the time I'll be sitting here, thus I asked for my chair. Notwithstanding that, last warning, test 2, midnight. Assignment 2, midnight. Anybody who doesn't submit by midnight, you make my life easy because there's nothing easier to give than a 0. Because I just go 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. So it's great. Makes my life easy. Doesn't make your life any easier, but it makes my life easy. Lab 9 is done. You can still show me your labs till next week for if you're willing to take a half grade percent, like a 50% hit on your grade, but at least if you get some points for your lab. Hybrids are due by the end of next week. I think that's what I said. I got to double check that. But basically, if you haven't done them by now, they're not going to do you a whole lot of good anyways. So, you know, that's that. All right. So those are the quick announcements at the start. What I'm going to do today is a series of triggers that have to do with inventory management. Now, a lot of places when you place an order and you buy more than one thing, other than Amazon, because Amazon's the exception to the rule, most places will not ship you your stuff piecemeal. They'll ship you your whole order at once. So for example, you go order 5 t-shirts off T-Fury. They'll send you all 5 t-shirts at once. And the way this is done is using systems called inventory allocation. And it's a fairly straightforward concept. And it's a business systems one where you guys haven't taken any business systems concepts yet. And I don't even know if you will. But it's actually a fairly straightforward concept. So the way it works is we have 10 things on a shelf. So 10 boxes on the shelf. And suddenly an order comes in. Tessa decided to order 2. So Tessa places her order, picks 2, hits pay. Bang. Now, the 10 things are still on the shelf because nobody's gone and picked them, packed them, and shipped them yet. They're still on the shelf. However, right afterwards, you know, Tara decides she wants to order something, but she'll only see that there's 8, even though there's still 10 on the shelf because Tessa bought 2. They've been allocated to Tessa's order. Great. So she sees 8. She places her order for 1. Now, Ray goes to place an order. He only sees 7, but there's still 10 on the shelf. They haven't gone anywhere. They've just been allocated for people. Hello? And then suddenly, you know, Joe, factory worker, comes by, grabs 2 boxes, puts it in the shipping box, tapes it shut, puts in a tracking number, and suddenly, once that's done, the person hit the magic button. Suddenly, now there's 8 on the shelf. So the allocation is released, and it decrements what's called on hand. So what on hand means is how many's on the shelf, and available is on hand minus allocations. Once it's been put in the shelf and shipped, on hand is reduced by the number in the allocation. So the logic works like this if I were to write it out. You have on hand. On hand means physically available. Allocated means when it's allocated, it means it's been promised to someone. Essentially, I'm going to put it in plain English. It's been promised to someone. And available is how many can we sell? So How many do we actually have minus how many have we already promised tells me how many we can still sell. It's fairly straightforward concepts for business. Stores like Walmart don't worry about allocations because their allocation is how many's on the shelf. You know, do you ever have the experience you go to the store and you go to Best Buy, for example, they say, this says you have 3 on available in the store. You walk in, you know, and you're buying yourself the latest console that just came out and it says we have 5 in stock. You walk up, they're all gone, but you ask the guy that says there's 5 in stock. The guy goes, yeah, it says there's 5 in stock. You look over and there's 5 in line to the cashier. Right? Retail stores don't worry about allocation. Their allocation is how many did they receive, not. So for them, on hand and allocated is the same thing. But when you're talking about online sales, that's how it works. Now, what I'm going to do is I've messed with my ThinkCube database. I've created an allocations table, and I added an on-hand column to my product versions. When I'm done this lecture, I'll actually give you guys the entire script. You can try and play with it. And just so that I don't make mistakes, and it looks really bad because it got crushed in my bag, but there's my triggers. I got a script I'm going to follow today. And as you can see, I forgot to put it in the right pocket. But I will literally be uploading that file to Brightspace for you guys, so you guys can actually see the end result. And I'll be talking about a few different concepts in this while I do it. But the very first step is allocating the inventory. So Tessa placed her order. We have to make sure that if there's 10 available, Tessa bought 2, Tara can't buy 10. Because 2 have been promised to Tessa. She hasn't given us her credit card information yet, so she's not allowed to buy 10. She could buy 8, but she can't buy 10. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to write a trigger that has to do with doing the allocations. Okay. Now, if you remember what I talked about triggers in Postgres last week, triggers are functions that execute at a certain point in time. And I am actually going to grab it bit by bit to show you guys the pieces that apply. So I'm going to start with the first bit. Okay. So I'm going to create a function. I'm going to call it allocate inventory. It returns a trigger. That's when you create a trigger, it has to return a trigger type. It's just a magic data type. And I'm going to declare a few things to start with. I'm going to declare 3 variables. How many do we have on hand? How many are allocated? And how many are available? Does that look familiar to what I wrote on the board? So those are the variables I'm going to play with. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is this. I'm going to explain this code. This is all part of the trigger. So what's a little bit weird in this one, you've never seen a select statement like this piece right there. Actually, Ray may have seen this, but he's got background on a different database server. When you want to retrieve a single value from the database, and I guess I should aim that camera at myself, not at the wall. All you get is the top half of my head. When you want to retrieve a value from the database and assign it to a variable, you're going to select into the variable. So this is specific to when you work with triggers. So I have on-hand inventory, which is declared up here. So I'm going to select on-hand into the inventory from product versions. In actual fact, I should show you the contents of that. There we go. Right here, you'll see on hand going down the side. So that's the available inventory of a given product. Where ID is equal to, and this is the first time you've seen the new and old thing. So this trigger is going to be an after insert trigger. In other words, we are going to create the allocation once the order line's been created. So every time somebody creates an order line, it's going to create a matching allocation. So Tessa goes and buys 2. It's going to create an order line saying Tessa's buying 2. And it's going to create an allocation saying Tessa bought 2. So the allocation has to match the order line, essentially. And what's happening is, if you remember when I talked about the special data structures in triggers last week, there's new and old. Since this is an insert, all I've got is new. And product version ID is the product version ID of the product I want to put in the order line. So it's going to come in on the as part of the new. Now, a few other things are in here after this. So essentially this is going to grab the on-hand inventory, put it in the variable. So suddenly my variable has a value. And you should always check if you're given a null. Anybody want to take a guess why you should always check to see if you've been given a null? Because you can't do math on a null. 1 minus null is null. Yes? Well, this won't be multiple results because I'm pulling from product versions and I'm actually targeting a specific version. So then you'd use something different, which I'll show you guys in a bit. You'd end up using a cursor and you have to loop through it. But in this case, I'm actually targeting a specific row in the database by using the primary key. So this ID here from product version matches the product version ID in an order line. So you can't have more than one product per order line. Therefore, you have only one product ID coming in. So, as I said, you always have to check to see if you got a null back, because it happens. As you can see, my very first row here has a null in it. So if it's null, I set it to 0. All right, so because 5 minus null is null. 1 million minus null is null. Database servers assume if you play with a null, everything is null. Instead of going 1 million minus the absence of nothing must be 1 million. No, it's 1 million minus the absence of nothing of everything equals absence of everything. It's just how the math works, or the logic of it works. So if your inventory comes back as null, we set it to 0, just to be on the safe side. Now, this you don't normally have. This raise notice. Raise notice is for debugging purposes. You know how you have a messages tab here in pgadmin? This actually basically prints into the messages. So you can actually debug and see what the values are as you go through the trigger. And once your trigger is written properly, you comment out all these raise notices. Otherwise, you end up sending extra noise back to the development environment. But it's a great way to debug so you can actually test. And the first time I wrote these triggers, I actually did it live in front of the class, and I spent 15 minutes trying to figure out why. Because I forgot about, 1 minus null is null. I was having a brain dead day, and I couldn't remember this basic piece of math. So I put in raise notice. Raise notice is similar to, in Java, doing an output to log. You know how you can output to standard I/O, and you can also output to log? Theoretically, there's a way of outputting to 2 places at the same time in Java. There's just a different output point. And it's the same idea. You're going to output to messages, not to the main line. So this will, once we write this trigger and I test it, you'll see it'll show me on hand, this is how many we have. So raise notice, you can also raise error, which I actually will have in a bit. And then the percent sign is a placeholder. So it'll say on hand inventory goes where the percent sign is. It's similar to printf, but not really, but close enough that you'll understand. Where printf, you have placeholders to format your output. Same idea. Yeah. Yeah. No, I am selecting a value from the table and putting it into the variable. So the table has an on-hand column, as you can see right here. I have a variable called on-hand inventory. So I'm going to go from product versions, I want to grab on-hand, and I'm going to put it into this variable. No. Yeah, the SQL server. Yeah, you can go the other side and put it on the outside. Not quite with this. Hold on. Did I answer your question? Roughly? Once I run it, it'll make a bit more sense. Yes, I'm requesting on hand from the product versions table, and I'm going to put the value that I get back from the query into the on hand inventory. Oh yeah, exactly there. What's cool is you can actually select multiple variables into multiple columns to multiple variables. The problem is with that one is that the syntax changes depending on what you're doing. So if you're going to do multiple values into multiple variables, usually you want to do it a different way because it gets a little weird and tricky. If you're doing single values into a single variable, this is the way to go. It's very quick, very... You can actually test this outside of a trigger. You can actually run it separately. Trigger returns it either returns the new data or the old data. It doesn't return anything else. Yeah. Well, the function returns an object when it's a trigger. If it's a regular trigger, I mean a regular function, yes, it returns a value or a list of values or an array. But when it's used as a trigger, it returns a trigger. All right. Now, this next block looks very similar. I am going into allocated inventory. I'm going to select from allocations where the version ID of the product matches, so the product version ID of the product matches. But I'm adding up all the allocated quantities. So Tessa bought 2, Tara bought 1, Ray bought 1. So how many did I just sell? 4. But how many allocations do I have? 3. But to know how many I have available, I have to add up all of theirs into a single number. So 2 plus 1 plus 1 is 4. That's what this line's doing. So I'm going to take all the allocated inventory, add them all up, and then assign it to that variable. So once again, I only get one value out of this query. It's the allocated values. Again, I check to see if I got a null back. Because in theory, if nothing's been allocated, I'll get a null back. Because if it's a different product and nobody's bought it yet, and I'll ask it, go tell me how many of these exist, and it adds up nothing. Therefore, what's 10 minus nothing? Nothing. Because that's what the computer is going to do. Therefore, if we get nothing back, we say we got 0 back. On the safe side. There are ways of actually tricking this into doing it as part of the select statement, but I've always found it easier to understand when it's written like this. As you can see, this looks identical to this, essentially. Now, we start doing a little bit of magic code. If you remember what I wrote on the board, available is equal to, and that's what I'm doing right here. This should look familiar to Java. I could actually give you guys a piece of homework. Take this trigger and turn that into Java code. It's actually really straightforward, and you could actually do it fairly quickly. Just pass in the parameters instead. You guys should be able to write this in 20 minutes. Again, just in case something weird happens and we didn't handle the null properly, always handle your nulls. If on-hand inventory minus allocated inventory is null, assume there's none available. Again, I do my raise notice. Murphy's Law would state something went wrong. You should never assume your values. Ever. In any system. Even in your Java code, you should never assume the value of what you're working with. Always test for all possible values applicable to the current condition set. And if something happens that goes weird up here and some unknown reason this did not trigger properly, you should still be. Yes, it is redundant in the sense that this should never happen. But I've had it in my career where code that should never have been seen in the public has been seen in the public. And sometimes it happens a lot faster than you think it does. So it adds no extra processing. Honestly, it's like, a millionth of a second just to make sure you're safe. I'm sure Howard discussed about how you should never assume everything and you should have test cases for all possible cases. Yeah, so it's the same idea there. So I'm just setting my available inventory. Now things get smaller now. Here's the next piece. If available inventory is less than or equal to 0, or the new quantity is greater than the available inventory, then we raise an exception. So far you've seen me raising notices, which is just debugging messages. Raise exception means no. It literally caused the entire transaction to fail and roll back. You know when you write a bad piece of SQL and it gives you an error message? You know when you're doing assignment 2 and you hit run and nothing got created even though it made it 3/4 of the way through? That's what this is doing. It gets to the end. It gets to this point and goes, oh, something's wrong. Roll back. Now if you're working with MySQL, it would not roll back. It would just bomb out. This will bomb out and say, all done now. And honestly, this looks very similar to any other language except, you guys aren't used to seeing an if statement that doesn't have brackets and curlies. But if available inventory is less than or equal to 0, because you shouldn't be able to sell something to someone if there's less than 0 available, and you shouldn't be able to sell it. Tessa bought 2, Tara wants 10, but I only had 10 to start with. She shouldn't be able to buy 10 if 2 have been given away already. Thus, you check to see if what she's asking for is more than what's available. And then, the last 3 pieces. All right. And then I do an insert. After all this checking, all this logic, we're going to do an insert. I'm going to add a new row to allocations. What am I going to include in it? The product version ID. So what am I allocating? The order line ID. What order line did I allocate this from? Because if she's got an order line and she's got an order line, I got to know whose allocation I'm playing with. How many are being allocated? And when was it allocated? It's kind of important to know when it was promised, right? Because most systems, the most recently allocated is going to be the next to be fulfilled. So it's just a straight up insert. So I'm going to insert the new product version ID, the new order line ID, the new quantity, and the current timestamp. Then I return new because I'm doing a trigger. And since it's a trigger, it has to return new or old. It always has to return either new or old. So we're going to return that. And then we have the last 2 pieces. We end the code, and we tell it it's written in PL/PGSQL. And I hit run, and we see how good my copy pasting's been. Copy pasting successful. Now, this function now exists, but it does nothing. It's not connected to anything, anywhere. It's just a function floating in the ether, totally unconnected. I'm going to break this down on a couple of lines. Okay, create trigger. I'm going to call it trigger allocate. After insert on order line, so every single time something is inserted into order lines and the insert is successful, it will then fire off allocate inventory. Now you can see it says for each row. That means if I insert 3 rows into order lines, it'll fire the trigger 3 times. So after it inserts each row, it'll fire the trigger. Each row will fire the trigger. Each row will fire the trigger. If any of those inserts fail or the trigger fails anywhere, the whole thing gets rolled back. Right to the beginning. It's like it never even happened. So the raise exception nullifies the whole thing. So now I'm going to hit run on this. And that worked. Oh, I think I can remember the structure of orders. Good enough. I think I can remember. There we go. So I just created myself a brand new order. I don't know what the ID is. All right, so here's my new order. This is a quick and dirty way to find out what the last thing you inserted was. It's not the right way, because I could do the insert and then somebody else could do an insert, then you'd get their ID, not your ID, but since I'm the only one playing with the database, that's good enough for now. Okay, so now, I don't want to forget my are those the important ones for order lines? Okay, so I just need to go 102. Perfect. All right, so it's just a bunch of numbers. You guys have played with this data already. You've seen this stuff. So I'm going to insert into order number 72,673, because that's the order. I'm going to add product number 102, which is this one here. See, there's 74 on hand. I'm going to buy 5 at $10 each, so it should cost $50. I'm going to go run. All right. Now, see the messages right here? That's my trigger firing off. On hand 74, allocated 0, available 74. And then there's nothing that just successfully returned. No other information. Now, if I were to go here and go, so if I still go product versions, 102 still at 74 because I haven't shipped any. I've allocated 5, but I have not shipped any. If I go select star from allocations, and this is where I find out if my code's right. 5 right here. So for order line 118,000, whatever, for product version 102, I've got 5 allocated. So now if I go back over here and I do this a second time, same order, I insert it a second time. Now I watch my trigger. On hand 74, I already had 5 allocated. 74 minus 5 is 69. And let's do it again. Oh, now I got 64. Because I got 10 allocated, it's just going to keep going down and down and down. So now if I go look at my allocations one more time, there's 3 allocations. 3 separate order lines. Pretty cool. It's all automated. Did you have to trust any programmers other than yourself? Trust your trigger. What do you think the odds of the same query happening in the same microsecond? So picture Tessa, Tara, and Ray all hitting their mouse button at the exact same time, all their computers sending the command at the exact same microsecond. And the database server processing all 3 of those at the same microsecond. The odds are non-existent. You'd have a better chance of winning the Lotto Max and get hit by lightning on the same day. Theoretically, yes, but the first one to fire wins. So if Tessa goes first, those 2 will wait their turn to happen. And then it'll do Tara's, and then it'll do Ray's. And if I run out of inventory by the time I get to Ray, that's too bad. Ray gets an error saying, oh, too bad, I can't do that right now. Done. You can. What you go in here is you need to refresh, but you have the trigger function here. It shows it right there. And if you look at order lines, you'll see there's a trigger attached to it here. So you can actually explore what you've done in this. All right, so far I have successfully created allocations. Yay! That is 3/4 of the fight. After now the next thing is, well then, what happens once the order's been packed? The order has been packed up, and the system receives the fact that it's happened. So what's going to happen is we are going to create a new function called adjust inventory. So what does adjust inventory do? The order has been packed, it's been marked as shipped. The system now needs to say on hand actually goes down now, right? Because the boxes with Tesla stuff has been put in it. That means I don't have 10 on the shelf anymore, I have 8. It's gone. 2 of them are gone. They're no longer mine. They are, you know, a bit that whole thing, hey, it's been shipped off to the customer. It's no longer our problem. Now it's UPS's problem or FedEx's problem. You know, and stuff disappears in FedEx, especially when it comes from computer manufacturers. Surprisingly, things get crushed all the time. I once got a free upgrade from Acer because of that. Because my laptop was sent out for repairs, and then it got crushed. $4,000 workstation got crushed. So I got a $4,500 workstation as a replacement. Because they didn't make the $4,000 one anymore. So it was a good day in my world. It was not a good day for FedEx, because they had to pay for the replacement laptop. Oh no, FedEx admitted they crushed it. As in they lost it. It got lost into the back of somebody's car. All right, so I'm going to create the adjust inventory. That means that it's been shipped. And this trigger is actually significantly shorter than the other one. However, it does have a few things that you haven't seen yet. All right, here's my declare section. I've got allocated inventory. It's an integer. However, there's something called order line, and it's a record. What is a record in a database? It's a row of data. What happens if you want to play with an entire row of data and you want to actually treat it like a variable? You got to declare it. What do you declare it as? As a record. Ta-da. So, I have a raised notice here for the shipped on date. Why? Because when I wrote this originally, I made a mistake and I was actually triggering off the wrong field. Surprise. So it's always good to have these nice messages along the way for debugging purposes. Okay. Now, if new that shipped on is not null, so let's say you're updating the order as in you put in a memo. You don't want to say it's been shipped yet. Maybe somebody just put in some extra notes saying, oh, the person made a mistake when they placed the order and they actually wanted large t-shirts instead of extra large. So instead of adjusting the order line, they might have put a note. Or customer requested that you do not put a receipt in the box because it's for a present. Right? Those are comments. They have nothing to do with the inventory. So if the shipped on date is not set, we shouldn't mess with the allocation. Or if the shipped on date changes, then we should do it. In other words, if the shipped on date is set, but if it's not the same as the old one, in other words, maybe we reshipped the order because FedEx broke it, or it was crushed into the back of someone's car, or it got porch pirated, right, in telecom. There's a car that follows our Intelcom guy around the neighborhood. I've seen him. Grabs the parcels off the front step. It's great. Lost. So sometimes Amazon will just ship you a new order when that stuff happens. So then what happens is I've checked to make sure that it's A, shipped on, or B, it's been reshipped. So here's what's going to look a little strange for some of you. For order line in. Now, did you guys learn about do you guys have for each in Java? Not a for loop, a for each. You loop through an array. It's not called for each, it's called something else. I just don't remember what. Okay. So essentially, it's basically for each item in this list. And the way it works is I am actually going to run a select statement. So what's going to happen is it's going to select everything from order lines that matches the order ID that I'm playing with. And for each row it returns, it's going to put it in order lines. So if I do this, nobody remembers what the heck that. All right, so I'm looking at order lines. These are the 3 order lines I've got. What do you mean? Yeah, because it's a number. Order ID is an integer. Don't quote your numbers. You're coercing the database, and it doesn't like being coerced. You're forcing a cast. Don't do it if you don't have to. So here's my 3 order lines. So what's going to happen is that, yes. For each is read only. It's the same. It's the same thing as a for each. But this one is for in instead. So it's going to say, in each of these, I'm in the wrong editor, but that's fine. For every row that's returned from this SQL statement, assign it in this, and now we're going to loop. So it's going to loop 3 times. Straightforward loop. So I'm going to raise a notice to make sure I'm playing with the right order line, because when you're debugging, you want to make sure you're messing with the right stuff. Later on, like I said, you turn this stuff off. I'm going to select the quantity into allocated inventory from allocations. So for every allocation, I'm going to retrieve a quantity from the allocation. And it's for each order line. So one order, this case is going to be weird because I bought the same thing 3 times in the same order, but no, we're going to go with it. I'm going to loop through what's in each line of the order. For each one of them, I'm going to see what's been allocated, assign it to a variable. This is the same as I did in the previous trigger. Again, I'm going to check for null. Why? Because 10 minus null is null. And Murphy's Law would state something's messed up somewhere. Don't trust the data. Just like you should never trust your user's input. Ever. Never trust what the user types in. It's bad. All right, so I'm going to check, see if set it to 0. Now I'm going to do 2 more things. And this one's a little odd. There's actually an enhancement I could do to this that's significantly better. But the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to update the product versions, and I'm going to set the on-hand to be equal to the on-hand value minus the allocation. Straight up math. Right? So literally that piece of math I have on the board. On-hand minus allocated equals available. So I'm actually going to make, but in this case, on-hand minus allocated, because it's gone, is the new on-hand. So once I've taken 2, put it in the box, I've taken 2 off the shelf. That means I now have 8 on the shelf. This is what I'm doing, is I'm saying I no longer have this available. That's pretty straightforward. The next one is where I've had some big debates with various students that have some history in information systems. I'm deleting the allocation. And I will admit, this is not what you should do. Being completely honest, you should not delete the allocation. What you should do is set a Boolean, true, false, allocated, processed, something. So if ever you need to go back to see when this was done, but for all intents and purposes, I'm just going to nuke it to make the trigger easier. Otherwise, I'd be writing like 10 times more lines of code to make sure it's all good. So I'm going to delete the allocation. So Tessa's stuff was put into a box. Box is taped. They've updated the order saying it's been shipped. We say, oh, there's 2 less on the shelf, and we delete the allocation. So it's like it never even happened. Okay? We end our loop. So for every order line, this loop will fire 3 times. Then we do our end if, we return the new, and we set our language. And I'm going to go run. It successfully worked. Doesn't mean it actually works, it just means that the trigger compiled. So now I'm actually going to create the trigger itself. So after each update on orders, I will execute adjust inventory. So every time an order is updated, it'll fire off this trigger. Now, it's checking inside the trigger to see whether or not, you know, the ship date's been set, etc., etc. There are actually ways of actually telling it, only fire this trigger when this field changes. You can actually, in Postgres at least you can. I don't remember if you can in Microsoft SQL Server. I know in MySQL you cannot. So in MySQL you can't, Microsoft SQL Server you can. Oracle you can, DB2 I think you can. Teradata you can't. You know, each server has its own little quirks. So my trigger exists. So now, and of course I don't remember my order ID, like such. All right, so I've created my trigger, and now we're going to see whether or not my code from 2 years ago still works. It's not shipped in, it's shipped on. I got to get the query right the first place, and it's not that either. Oh, should have done it. And do you see what's wrong in this? I don't have this column. And in my trigger, I'm actually looking for that column also, so my trigger would never actually work. So what does that mean? I have to go and do alter table orders, add column, shipped on, timestamp. Do this? Oh, come on. Okay, that's done. Now let's try this again. I got an error. Actually, I don't have an error. It worked. This is my notice saying it worked. So now if I go look at my allocations, I go, my allocations table should be empty, and it's not. Oh, we're going to have some fun now. Great. Okay, that's good. Now you get to see me debug. Not that. Just want to do this and try it again. Order ID this, order line number this. Now it worked. Okay, I had an extra notice and now it's working. Select star from allocations is gone. Why did it work the second time? I don't know. I didn't change any code. When things like that happen. Actually, I know why. Because I added the column after I created the trigger. I had to rebuild the trigger so that everything was in the right place in the right order. Ta-da! So, now, if we remember, how many items did I have available for item 102? 74. So now if I go select star from product versions where ID is equal to 102, I now have 59. Why? Because I've shipped 15. Totally automated. No Java code to rely on. No third-party programmer to rely on. And as a database developer, and I'm also the front-end developer and the middleware developer, I don't trust myself. Much less would I trust somebody else with my data. So just because you've said the rules are this, you know, you've defined your rules from start to end, you said this is how it's supposed to be, this is how you're supposed to do this, etc., etc., etc. The strange thing is, they don't always listen. And what do you do when they don't listen? They create bugs. And they allow null values to be inserted into fields. They allow, you know, negative allocations. What would happen if you put in a negative allocation? 5 plus 5 minus 5 is 5. Suddenly, because somebody screwed up and they flipped a sign on one of their numbers, you're lying about 5 items, which is bad. If it's all coded inside the database, and a lot of people argue about whether or not you should do that inside the database, because it adds processing time, as he mentioned. The triggers add a little bit of overhead. Honestly, sometimes it's worth it getting the database to do it. Now, there are some other quirks, however. So I want to play with 201. So now I'm going to go over here. I just want to go back to my create order. I just got to go back a few moments in time. Okay, I'm going to create a new order. And I am going to copy. Undo is magical, you know. You can just replay the entire thing you just did by going back and forth in time. That's why I want the next order ID that I just created, because I created a new order to play with. Out of here, I just right-click. You just Control-C. So now, if I remember right, I wanted to go play with 201. Remember that whole null thing? No, not that. For some unknown reason, I've gone into overwrite mode. Let's try that one more time. The insert key. Now I'm going to run my trigger. I'm going to run my insert. And it shows allocated 0, on hand 0, available 0. And here's my error message. Insufficient unallocated inventory to fulfill the order. So because there's no inventory available, you shouldn't be allowed to place an order. This raised an error. That means that this order line was never created. It failed. Makes no difference. Well, let's try it though. What the hell? Let's see if Felipe found a bug. Insufficient, because I'm handling. Is it less than 0? The first time I wrote this to the students, I forgot that one, and somebody asked the same question. This, you know, took originally two periods to write as a group. So I went down to the shortened version for you guys. Now, this handles everything. Now, what happens here is error. So now, your trusty Java developer wrote some code that does an insert. And it does the insert and it fails. He gets an error message back from the database saying, insufficient unallocated inventory. Congratulations. He now has an error to trap at his end and make it pretty for the end user. Honestly, You don't normally write your error codes like this. You'll return something that they can reference easily, like ERR001. Because then they can define it as constants in their code, and they can refer to it easily. But for this intents purposes, it was easier to show it in plain English. But if I go back to 103, so one that is not null, my numlock key is off. Is that my problem? There we go. I do 103 with the negative. This one actually worked. And that actually should be interesting. Let's go see what happened in here. I wonder if it's going to show -5. Hot damn, I'm not handling my negatives. So, well then. What happens if I update my order now? Yeah. Well, this is what's called testing, right? And that's why you should have test cases for everything. I'll admit it. That's actually something I never even thought of doing at that point, because I proved that I couldn't from a null. I never thought of testing at that point. That's great. So what was my message that we got already? Hold on. If I go look at allocations, no. Which one did I play with? 103? 103, okay. 168. Okay. I haven't played with it yet. It's still at 168. What's going to happen if I try to feed it a negative? Okay. That worked. Stayed at 168. Apparently you can't negative a negative. But my inventory didn't go down. My allocation's still there. Oh, that's weird. Why is that not working? That is just the weirdest thing ever. Did that work? Allocation. It works on the second one. Why is it not working on the first go? This is starting to ring a bell. And now 103's gone up. 10 minus 5 is 15. If you negative a negative, it makes it positive. So we should be updating our code in here to not allow negative values. However, there might be a reason why you want to handle the negative value. Yes, returns, RMAs. It's at shipping, and the customer calls up and says, I can't afford this. Did you catch it before it got on the truck? Yes. We will charge you a restocking fee of $10. So that they, because FedEx will actually charge a lot of companies a small fee if they cancel an order after the label's been printed. Restocking fee, therefore we want to update the allocation with a negative value. We create a negative allocation and give it back to it. Theoretically, or we just update the on-hand inventory. There's a couple of us handling it. So theoretically, should we allow the negative? Yes. However, should we allow it in the allocate inventory? No. So honestly, what we should be doing is this. We could add a new one of these and say if there. Therefore, we no longer have the negative problem at this point. It'll bomb out if you try to feed it a negative value. And to prove that this works, grab the whole function, come back over here, come up to the top, paste it, run it, delete, try it again. You cannot supply negative value. Quantity. Done. All right, we fixed Felipe's problem. Easily enough to fix. The logic is straightforward. It's just standard programming logic. It depends on what the rules are. If the rule says you're not allowed a negative, you're not allowed negative. End of story. And that is that. That is literally the set of inventory allocation triggers. And this has one of absolutely almost everything you'd use inside a trigger. You're setting variables, you're looping through records, you're doing some basic arithmetic, you're updating records, you're inserting records, you're raising notifications, you're raising errors. It's one of absolutely everything you'd normally use inside a trigger. Yes? It's there, but it's not in use until you do something with it. Yes, but first you have to delete. Okay, two parts, right? There's a trigger function and a trigger. First you have to delete the trigger, then you delete the function. Yeah, so this is what's cool about Postgres, which is not common in other database servers, and I think that includes my Microsoft SQL Server. Because Microsoft SQL Server, MySQL, and I think Oracle, the trigger the code for the trigger is inside the create trigger command. With Postgres, you can actually create a function, and you don't need to keep recreating the trigger. You create a function, and you could actually create a function and share it across multiple triggers. That means if you need to fix a bug, where do you fix it? One place. When it's part of the body, you have to actually rewrite all your triggers, start a transaction block, and update all the triggers at the same time, and usually you do that during a downtime. This, you can actually do hot patches. Because if you notice there's a bug like, oh, we allowed a negative value. Well, that's easy to fix. Boom, fixed. Instant.
Is there a way to select a trigger, like a table or something from a table?
No. No.
So I cannot see the content of the trigger.
No more than if you're running a Java application, you can ask it to show you the code. It's happening in the background. The other quirk about Postgres' triggers is there's something called, there's some magic variables. One called TG_op, TG_OP, it's all uppercase. That will tell you if that's an insert, an update, or a delete. So you can actually write a trigger that changes its behavior based on whether it's an insert or an update. So you can say, you can write one trigger that works all the time after something's been created, but you can actually determine whether or not when it's actually firing, what event fired it off. Is it a before insert, an after insert, a before update, an after update? And you can actually write one big function that does all this work. Now, the other quirk about Postgres, which I don't know if it applies to Microsoft SQL Server, is you can define multiple triggers on the same table. Okay, you can't do that in MySQL. And I don't remember about Oracle, but I think Oracle allows it. Now, the way Postgres handles it is pretty elegant. If I go look at the allocate inventory trigger function, you'll see down here there's a cost. I never put in the word cost. I can determine the expensiveness of the trigger. And it uses this to determine when it's going to run it. That's thing number one. Item number two, the triggers. How does it decide which trigger is actually going to fire off in each order? And Ray's going to love this answer. Yeah, oh yeah, you can see it by browsing through the administrative tools. But there is actually a way to select it out of the database, but it's actually really convoluted. You'll love this, Ray. Alphabetical. A fires before B, fires before C. However, there is a way now to tell it the order of precedence. I just don't remember what the command is off the top of my head. But there's a way of telling it that this trigger should fire before the other trigger. But it allows you to actually chain triggers one behind the other, which is cool. No. It's as if you have a long, okay, in your Java code, you got your function main, and you call procedure 1, then you call procedure 2, then you call procedure 3, and it happens in that order. It's the same idea. It'll fire off trigger 1, trigger 2, trigger 3. That's it. Oh no, that's not the trigger call in the trigger. It's the whole, it's the processing. So it goes, you do the update, it'll go before trigger 1, before trigger 2, before trigger 3. Then it'll go after trigger 1, after trigger 2, after trigger 3, or 4, 5, 25, 30. If any of those fail, They all fail. It's all part of the same transaction block. And that's all there is to that today. So what I'm going to do